Welcome to Tuesday of Holy Week as we continue on looking at the events of Jesus' life that leads him to the cross and eventually to an empty tomb. On Tuesday, Jesus is going back to Jerusalem. The king's authority is questioned, and he's ultimately rejected by the leaders who should have recognized him. In Matthew 21, verses 23, it says, Jesus entered the temple courts, and while he was teaching, the chief priests and the elders of the people came to him, and they asked him, by what authority are you doing these things? Who gave you this authority? And so that is the backdrop with which Jesus begins his teaching in the temple. Now, on the way, you remember on Monday, as he was going through the Mount of Olives into Jerusalem from Bethany. Now, he has spent the night on the Mount of Olives tonight. As they pass by the fig tree again, they notice that it is withered, that it is just no longer alive. And the disciples wonder about this, and they begin to ask him. They go, Jesus, what happened to the tree? And he says if it doesn't have good fruit, he's gonna get rid of it. But then he goes on and he begins to teach them, and he says, listen, if you have faith in God, you could say to this mountain, be cast into the sea, and you would be cast into the sea. Now, I know that you probably heard that all your life, and you may not have put it into the context of it being as a part of Holy Week that Jesus made these comments. So as you are going through your study this week, and you are reading through the Gospels, and you are looking at the events of Jesus' life, you can say, okay, I remember that. I remember where that came into play. And so he says, if you have faith also, whatever you ask for in prayer, then it will be given to you. Now, we know that we have to ask within the will of God, and it's not just asking for whatever we want, but it's asking for God to be glorified and God's will to be done. But this is the point at which Jesus is telling his disciples this as they're heading back into Jerusalem. Now, when they get into the temple, as we read in Matthew chapter 21 right there, the teachers of the law, they come to him and they say, what authority are you using to teach? Who gave you this authority? Because what they're thinking is, we certainly didn't give you the authority to come and teach. And Jesus says, let me ask you a question. By what authority was John's baptism? Where did it come from? Was it from heaven or was it from men? Now, this puts the leaders of the temple, this puts the Pharisees, this puts all of that group into a quandary, because they began to gather. They're silent to Jesus, and they begin to argue with each other, and they say, if we say from heaven, then Jesus is going to say, why didn't you believe John? And if we say from men, the Bible says that they were afraid of the people, and the people saw John as a prophet. And so they came back to Jesus and they said, Jesus, we don't know. So even though they tried to question his authority, they couldn't come up with a way of showing that he had no authority. And the reason being is because he has all authority. He is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. Now, as we go on, after his authority is questioned, you'll see that he enters into some parables of judgment as you read through Matthew and Mark and Luke. And some of these are pretty familiar to you. There's the parable of the two sons, where the father tells one son to go out into the field and to work in the harvest. And the one son goes, sure, Dad, I'll go. And then he doesn't. And then the other son says, no, I won't go. And then he does. And Jesus says, which one did the will of his father? And of course they answer the second one, the one that actually did what his father wanted him to do. And then he goes into the parable of the wicked tenants. This is the one where it talks about a landowner who owns a vineyard, and people came in and he had given it over to some people to tend and to keep. And as they were tending it, the landowner sends a messenger and they kill him. And the landowner sends another messenger and they kill him, and it continues on. And he says, well, surely I'll send my son, and they won't kill him. And in the parable he says, and they killed the son as well. And so these are known as parables of judgment that Jesus begins to condemn the leaders of the nation of Israel, the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the religious leaders with. Well, after that, they begin to try to trap him, and they ask him several questions to try to get him to say something that they can bring him to the authorities about. And the first one is about paying taxes. They go, is it all right, Jesus, to pay taxes? That's when he says, let me see a coin. And he looks at it, he says, whose face is on this? And they say, Caesar's. And then he says, render to Caesar what is Caesar's. And then there's this question about the resurrection. And the Sadducees, who didn't believe in the resurrection, asked him this long, involved question. And Jesus said, listen, you don't quite understand what the Bible has to say about this. But understand this, God is not the God of the dead, but he's the God of the living, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And this silenced the critics there, and one by one they couldn't answer him. And so as he's going through, now he begins to teach. And he asks them a question. He says, in Psalm 110, David writes, the Lord said to my Lord, and he brings that psalm up, and he says, how can David say to his son that he's a Lord? And he calls him the Messiah. And the Pharisees had no answer. And so Jesus begins to instruct the disciples, and he says, listen, you need to be humble. And you don't need to exalt yourself. And he begins to condemn the Pharisees and the religious leaders for caring more about their own appearance and neglecting the needs of the others. You'll see all of these as you begin to read through and you begin to see what Jesus is teaching. And then Jesus mourns once again over Jerusalem. And he looks out over Jerusalem and he says, Jerusalem, you killed the prophets that were sent to you, and you stoned them, those that were sent to warn you. And he says, I wish I could gather you all up as a chicken gathers up her hens under her wings. But then he says this, he says to the people of Jerusalem, even though they wouldn't see him, he says, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. You can find all of that in Matthew chapter 23, verses 37 through 39. Jesus is looking at the state of the people in Jerusalem, and he's lamenting that state. And he's trying to teach them, and he's also condemning them. We also see on Tuesday, this is the point at which he begins to talk about the widow's mite. There's these rich people that comes in, and this is in Luke chapter 21, and they're putting in their money, and Jesus is watching this with his disciples and others that are gathered around him, and this poor widow comes in with 2 copper coins, and she puts it into the treasury. And Jesus said, you see that woman? She put in more in the treasury than all of them put together, because she put out of her poverty, she put all that she had to live in and put her trust in God. They're putting in out of their wealth and not putting anything in that would cause them to trust the Lord. So there's a lot of things going on Tuesday that Jesus is beginning to talk to the people about. He talks to them about the destruction of the temple, and that at a point in their future history that not one stone was going to be left upon another. This is also a fulfillment of a prophecy. He then leaves Jerusalem and he goes back up to the Mount of Olives, and in Matthew chapter 24, Mark chapter 13, and Luke 21, you see this recorded, the Olivet Discourse, where he talks about the coming judgment that is to happen. He talks to his disciples and he warns them. He says, listen, if they hated me, they're going to hate you even more. And he begins to warn them that persecution is coming. And then he begins to prepare them that he's going to die. And he tells them, he says, nobody knows when the final days are coming except the Father, but you'll know when certain things begin to happen. And he gives them an understanding of that. Then he teaches the people that have gathered around, and he gives them several parables. And one of those parables that you may remember is the parable of the 10 virgins, that they were to be ready when the bridegroom came to take them home and to take them into the bridal chamber. And 5 didn't take care of business, and they weren't ready when the bridegroom came, but the other 5 had trimmed their lamps and filled their vats of oil. And he comes and he takes them away, and the 5 without come and they ask, they say, listen, can we have some of your oil? And they say, no, you missed it. See, there's a lot going on Tuesday in this Holy Week. He tells them of the parable of the talents during this time. And he talks to them about using what God has given each one of us for God's glory, not for ours. That God expects us to use the talents and gifts that are given to us. He continues on, and you see that he finishes out the Olivet Discourse, and he dismisses the people, and then he waits for the next day. But throughout this Tuesday, what you see is that the religious leaders are questioning the authority of Jesus, and they reject him. And Jesus continues to talk about what is to come, the days that are ahead. There's power and authority in faith, that if we would just believe. And that our faith is seen in humility. You'll see that as you look through the day's events, as you read the Gospels. You'll understand that there will be a judgment that is to come. This is the day that Jesus makes that very clear. And there's also the fact that Jesus silenced all his critics. No one could bring a word against him. In Psalm 118, verse 22, there's a prophecy that Jesus would be rejected as the capstone, the chief cornerstone. In Matthew 21:42, you see the fulfillment of that prophecy. In Psalm 78:2, it says that Jesus will speak in parables with hidden meanings. And you see that on this day taking place. On this Holy Week, day of Tuesday, I pray that you are continuing to study, continuing to reflect upon what Jesus has done for us, and realize that each and every day that is to come, Jesus knew that it would end on a cross on Friday. And so he knew without a shadow of a doubt what was going to happen to him, and he goes anyway. That's a God that loves us. I pray that you're blessed on this Tuesday, on this Holy Week day, and I pray that you'll be looking at what Jesus has done in your life and drawing closer to him. May God bless you. Have a wonderful day until we see you tomorrow. Bye.